Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very glad to be here in Warsaw, the vibrant capital of Poland. And I have a lot of slides today, so let's jump right into it. So one of the questions that some people ask is, why don't we understand actually our society based on microscopic laws of human behavior, as well as we understand our physical world based on elementary particle physics? And so the question is social behavior predictable, or do we need to give up on it? I'd like to start with the example of traffic flow. And here are some empirical plots which show how complex actually traffic patterns can be. I must admit that had I seen these plots when we started to do traffic modeling, I would have given up on modeling traffic right away. But by that time, we had already made some progress, and it turns out that we can understand the mysterious puzzles of traffic flows, in particular, phantom traffic jams that are forming without an accident, without an obstacle, just by spontaneous emergence. And you can see there was a very small perturbation in the flow, and it caused a situation that nobody wants. You would think that everybody has the right data and technology to do a good job. Nobody wants to stop, but still, because of the systemic instability, it happens. And the question is, what can we do about it? And fortunately, there is a science, complexity science, that allows us to understand such counterintuitive behavior. As I said before, those complex traffic patterns that I've shown you in the beginning can be cut down into elementary patterns. Those might be compared to the elementary particles in physics. And moreover, those elementary patterns can actually be simulated with simple computer models. I should say that those simulations existed before we had the data and could compare basically the predictions with the empirical facts. But we have a very good correspondence, and we also have a good understanding what kind of elementary traffic patterns are actually emerging. So this is what we call a phase diagram. It shows the possible traffic states, like free traffic or stop-and-go waves or homogeneous congested traffic, as a function of the upstream flow on the freeway and the bottleneck strength, which could in this case be caused by inflowing traffic on an on-ramp. So along the diagonal lines, we have constant overall traffic, and as we go from here to there, the traffic volume increases. So we go from free traffic to congestion, but it turns out that also the initial condition matters. There is history dependence. Small perturbations would create this phase diagram, while large perturbations would create a different phase diagram, which means that if we're in this kind of parameter regime, we could have different possible outcomes. This is called multistability. And that's quite interesting because it allows us to understand seemingly contradictory pieces of evidence, because one experiment could tell us there is free traffic, and another experiment could tell us there is a pinned localized cluster or a moving localized cluster. And we would usually conclude in social science that, while we cannot bring it together, we cannot develop a general theory. But considering this parameter dependence and the multi-stability and history dependence of these kind of phenomena, we can actually come up with a general explanation. So the question is, could we do the same in other areas? Comparing again with empirical data, you can see there are clear patterns, and these patterns actually confirm very nicely the theory that was developed before. Moreover, this theory is predictive. It allows you to predict the extent of traffic congestion and also the expected delay times. What I'd like to claim now is that we can not just understand traffic, but also opinion formation, social coordination, cooperation, norms, conflict, and many more things. But in many cases, it requires to go away from deterministic models and to consider noise. In particular, noise can promote the formation of opinion clusters, of groups, and thereby explain diversity despite convergence, a phenomenon that has puzzled many researchers for a long time, particularly regarding continuous opinion formation models. Here's some experimental evidence published in PNAS that shows actually that when there's an information exchange between people and people decide repeatedly, then there is the phenomenon of convergence. So that's a very clear empirical evidence. And the question is, why could it happen that over some time people still have different opinions? Why don't we all agree on the same things? And in order to explain this, people have developed a bounded confidence model saying basically that people would not listen to people with two different opinions. In this way, you could have different kinds of opinions still after some time. But the assumptions are not very well supported by empirical facts. And if you add a little bit of noise, you again end up with convergence. So the question is, how then can we explain the formation of opinion clusters of different kinds of opinions? And we have developed what we call the Dirk Helbing model. In this model, the convergence trend is stronger when people have similar opinions, but if they have dissimilar one, there's still some mutual influence. On the other hand, we assume some opinion noise, and that opinion noise in a particular model was assumed to become stronger the more people agree on one opinion. That means there is the tendency towards individualization, to be special, to have an own opinion, and that creates an interesting kind of dynamics which very much reminds the plots that you can now see in connection with the German elections, but with any other election as well. So opinion trends are going up and down because of this randomness, and opinion clusters merge and split up as we see it in reality as well. Noise can also trigger symmetry breaking and give rise to interesting phenomena such as social conventions. So I've been studying pedestrians a lot and have discovered this lane formation phenomenon, and moreover I found that there is a preference for one side. In most European countries that's the right-hand side, in Japan it's the left-hand side, but you will find lane formation in basically every country and a social convention about the preferred side as well. And it turns out that this is a coordination game, in fact. So people are standing in front of each other, and they will be successful only if they both evade each other on the same side. It means both go to the right-hand side or both go to the left-hand side. Otherwise, they will find each other not successful. And that is kind of encoded in this coordination game matrix where B is a positive payoff if people do the same thing. And then you can derive equations, basically predict how the relative proportion of going to the right or to the left will change with time. And this is the so-called replicator equation that can actually be derived assuming imitation of more successful behavior. And if we plug in this payoff matrix, we eventually get this equation. And it turns out that it has 3 stationary solutions. P equals 1/2, P equals 1, and P equals 0, corresponding to a 50-50 situation, and would kind of be the natural state of that kind of game. So people would go to the right-hand side and 50% of the time, and to the left-hand side and 50% of the time. Why don't we find that situation? Well, it turns out that this stationary solution is unstable, and that means very small fluctuations can drive the system away from the 50-50 situation, ending up in a situation of a social consensus, a social convention. And of course, we can also plug in other kinds of payoff matrices into the replicator equation. And you know the prisoner's dilemma, which is kind of an archetypical kind of game to study social dilemma situations where in principle it would be good for everybody to cooperate, but where cooperation is risky and defection is tempting, because if everybody else cooperates and you don't, you get an extra payoff. And that can lead to an erosion of cooperation, and finally to a tragedy of the commons that nobody wants, like the traffic jam. So as in the traffic example, free flow, the desirable state was unstable, and we ended up in an undesirable state, the traffic jam. Here, cooperation is unstable, and this game ends up in the undesirable state, which is defection, where everybody gets a very poor payoff. And so many scientists have been working on the question how this tragedy of the commons can be overcome in social dilemma situations, and people have identified a number of biological and social mechanisms basically transforming the prisoner's dilemma into other games which allow cooperation to happen under certain kinds of conditions. And here are some arrows that indicate how different mechanisms modify the prisoner's dilemma interactions effectively. The kin selection leads into this area, and direct reciprocity leads here. Also indirect reciprocity, that means reputation effects, for example, punishment as well. And finally, network interactions can push it into the area of the snowdrift game. So this is, of course, important for social order to emerge, because social dilemma situations occur in many places of our society, and civilization is in particular about finding such kind of mechanisms that allow us to overcome tragedies of the commons. There are a number of other mechanisms, and they're quite interesting. So let's look into the effect of mobility, for example. We would think that if we add mobility to imitation of the best performing neighbor, that shouldn't create any particular effects. And let's have a look at the situation where we simulate a periodic grid with some empty spaces. Blue means cooperation, red means defection. And if we have just an imitative dynamics, then we find something that we expect, namely that the level of defection goes up. Here it does not lead to full defection, because this is a simulation without noise, a deterministic simulation. We'll add noise in a moment. Let's have a look at migration, success-driven migration, which is within a certain radius around you looking for a place where you expect to have a higher payoff. Of course, if you just have migration, then the fraction of cooperators cannot change. We stay with a 50-50 situation, but we have a spatial rearrangement. Now the question is, if we combine the two, what will happen? And I was quite surprised, actually, to see this happen. where we find now an increase in the level of cooperation, while none of those mechanisms and separation was able to increase cooperation. So there's a co-evolution here between social behavior and spatial organization that suddenly allows cooperation to thrive through the formation of large cooperative clusters. As you can see, the defectors chase the cooperators, but they're always one step behind. And this very temporal advantage actually is crucial for the cooperation to thrive here. Now, nasty reviewers have been asking justified questions. So what would happen if somebody in the center of such a cooperative cluster would turn a defector? Well, he could really thrive on this cooperation around him, and wouldn't that destroy cooperation? So we have been looking at the effect of noise. One noise was basically assuming that people would randomly do the opposite of what would otherwise be expected with a certain probability. You can see if we start with everybody cooperating in the beginning, that really destroys cooperation, as the reviewers expected to happen. And then we were looking at random migration. So you go to a conference in Warsaw, fall in love, and somehow that changes everything. And let's see what happens. Oh, well, it's also not so good for cooperation. So it's also destroying social cohesion, as you can see over here. But again, we end up in a tragedy of the commons, as would be expected for a prisoner's dilemma. And then I was asking my PhD student, Wenjanu, to combine all those effects. That means imitation of the best neighbors with successful migration, plus those noises that were very destructive. And I was then asking him, have you done the simulation? And he said, well, you don't even need to do that. You will not find anything interesting. And 2 weeks later, I came back and asked him, have you done the simulation? And he said, really, it doesn't make any sense. And so I had to sit next to his desk and say, do it, please. Now I want to see what's going on. And to make it more interesting, we started off with everybody defecting. So what will happen here? So this is really hell on earth. Everybody is nasty. And then we have this random migration, which divides this initial cluster into small social clusters. And after a very long time period, you see, just by coincidence, there is a small cooperative cluster forming. And once a supercritical cooperative cluster has formed, cooperators thrive and are imitated by defectors. That means cooperation spreads very quickly in the system. It just takes a long time. And it always happens. You don't need to have luck or the right random numbers. It always happens. So this is an outbreak of cooperation, which couldn't happen without noise in the first place. So noise can have constructive function in some sense. And maybe you've asked yourself, okay, why are our social data so noisy, as compared to physics or biology or whatsoever? It's annoying. But it has a reason. Noise is important for many nice things to happen, in particular cooperation. Now, these days we're networking our world. We are creating connections between almost everything. The Internet of Things is just in front of our door. How is this changing our world? Well, unfortunately, it's going potentially to destabilize our world. You can see, while some connection density is good, and increasing it will increase the level of cooperation, but then you reach a maximum, and once you go beyond that, actually you again end up in this situation of a tragedy of the commons. So it's known, of course, for some time that neighborhood interactions can be beneficial for cooperation. But the warning is, don't network too much because it will cause a high price, as we have seen it in the financial markets where we had this financial meltdown. And here you see a visualization by Frank Schweitzer and others from the FOC project showing bankruptcy cascades in the United States. So Lehman Brothers collapsed and many other banks after that as well. There was a cascade effect and hundreds of billions of dollars were burned by that. In fact, Andy Haldane of the Bank of England has looked at the networks between banks and has found that the network density has increased a lot. So that could very well have been the root cause of the financial meltdown. That warns us that we have to be careful. Now, people have been thinking about other mechanisms to stabilize cooperation, such as costly punishment. Punishment comes at a cost. You have to invest somehow. It's stressful, or you have to take a lawyer or call the police or whatever. Anyway, people have been asking, why would one do such a thing? Why would people invest a cost into punishment if they could basically live on the punishment efforts of others? And you could save the effort yourself. And that would be, as we say, a second-order free rider dilemma, that you want to benefit from other people enforcing social norms. I'll come to social norms later on, while not making a contribution to this. So in order to study this, we have been looking at an extended strategy space where people could cooperate but not punish, shown in blue, where they could defect and not punish, shown in red, where they could cooperate and punish non-cooperative behavior, shown in green, and where they could defect but still punish defectors. So that would be a hypocritical behavior. And so you can see this in a simulation. The first snapshot shows the initial condition where we have 25% of each strategy, and the strategies are homogeneously and randomly distributed in space. And then after some time you see that red is dominating, which means defection is spreading as we would expect. Actually, if you do that very same simulation without spatial interactions, you find that the yellow strategy will disappear right away, and then the punishing cooperators, which we sometimes call moralists, disappear as well, because they have a higher cost than the cooperators. So the cooperators are basically crowding them out. And then finally, we have cooperators left together with defectors. And we know in a prisoner's dilemma situation or public goods game, cooperators would disappear. So it was a mistake to crowd out the punishing cooperators, but it just happens. So you end in a tragedy of the commons without spatial interactions. The interesting point is doing exactly the same kind of simulation, just considering spatial interactions or network interactions, leads to a completely different outcome, because rather than spreading defection more, we find that eventually blue takes over and finally green takes over. So why is that happening? Because we have a spatial segregation of strategies here, and it means that now the punishing cooperators don't have to compete with the cooperators who don't pay a punishment cost anymore, so they can survive. They're good actually in the struggle with the defectors because they're punishing them, making defection basically unprofitable. while the cooperators also have to struggle with the defectors, and we know that in this case the defectors are spreading. So over time, for this reason, green is spreading and blue is disappearing, and I'd like to show you a movie demonstrating this surprising dynamics where you really cannot extrapolate into the future because there is a non-monotonic dynamics in time. So this is really something where self-organization in space and time matters. And suddenly the second-order free rider dilemma is solved just by implementing this game in a spatial setting. There are also some surprising other findings, like for certain parameter combinations, more or less the cooperators who punish can only thrive by a kind of unholy symbiosis with immoralists who are the defectors who punish although they defect themselves. And that's happening in this area. So again, we have created phase diagrams to see what are the conditions which would that certain things happen. And you see, depending on where you are, and that could also be the cultural setting that makes the difference in the parameters, you could have a very different outcome. So if you have study A in Germany, study B in Poland, and study C in Japan, trying to study the same thing, but with people having a different cultural background, you could be in different areas of the parameter space and find different outcomes. But such a theory might allow you still to understand the difference in the experimental outcomes. So there might be a unifying theory. It's also interesting to look at multi-population games. And as you can imagine, things become much more complicated here. So we can have a lot of different outcomes depending on the parameters of the game. This is again 2x2 games. And here a harmony game, stack hunt, prisoner's dilemma, and snowdrift game. And this is with interactions with the other population and self-interactions within the own population, and that's without interactions with the other population, that's without self-interaction. So you find really a very rich behavior, and that can include breakdown of cooperation, polarization, and actually the emergence of a revolution, a revolutionary transition where you change a parameter just very slightly and suddenly the outcome of the system changes dramatically. You can have emergence of subcultures and conflict, and you can have the formation of shared behavioral norms, all within one model that can be analytically solved, by the way. So you can really calculate the stationary points and their stability. And it's a fascinating model. You can understand a lot of things with this model. And let's have a look into the multi-population stack hunt game. As I said, that can give rise to the formation of norms under certain conditions. So what we assume is that people get a reward for showing their preferred behavior. In population 1, people prefer behavior 1. In population 2, people prefer behavior 2. Population have different sizes, so we call this the strength of the population. And there's also a reward for conforming with the behavior of the person you're interacting with. And so you have kind of two competing rewards. And what you find is that there is a parameter regime where everybody tends to show the own preferred behavior. It's a laissez-faire society. Everybody can just do what he likes. While if one population becomes too strong, then their preferences basically will win through, and the other population will adapt. Under certain conditions, it turns out that if the minority actually is very committed to their own preferred behavior, they might be able to establish the norm. We call this the phenomenon of an unfavorable norm because the majority would not like it, but it can happen. So the initial condition really matter, as can be shown over here, and that means this kind of game has a history dependence, as we know it from many social phenomena. And we can also ask ourselves, what would happen if local majorities that happen just by chance, because of randomness, would basically put a pressure on the local minorities. And then if you start with a mixed situation, then just by coincidence you get these local majorities then are starting to suppress the minorities, and you find a spontaneous emergence of local norms under conditions where we would otherwise have a laissez-faire society where everybody can just do what he likes. So this is quite interesting, in particular as we can really calculate the conditions under which these things are expected to happen. And so the question is that a predictive theory? Well, we're right now testing it in the lab. And it turns out, again, that considering noise is very important. We've found that a best response rule, which is a deterministic decision rule, describes 96% actually, of all the decisions that were taken in our experiments. So it's a very accurate model, the best response model, but it fails to describe the outcome of the experiment. So you see the green bar as compared to the gray bar, there is a huge difference. While if we add noise, which brings us to a multinomial logic model in the end, we have a completely different outcome on the macro scale. So a little bit of noise can really change the macroscopic outcome dramatically. And certainly we can explain the empirical findings. So more of this is going on, and more of this is in our paper, which is currently submitted. And then finally, conflict. I've been studying data of conflict in Jerusalem, one of the old big problems in the world, conflict in the Middle East, and it turns out that there is kind of response dynamics where one conflict event triggers another conflict event. So somehow that's like paying revenge for what happened before. And you might interpret that as an attempt, basically, to tell the others that, come on, stop this violence, don't do that, it doesn't pay off. So in order to pass on the message, you pay revenge, and of course the other side again pays revenge, and it creates an escalation dynamics. And all of this can be modeled with an agent-based model, as we've done, considering spatial proximity and, of course, dynamics. But what turns out to be particularly important here to understand the dynamics is the social cultural distance between different groups, in particular different religious groups, but also security forces. And we can quite well reproduce the empirical findings, and moreover we can simulate counterfactuals. That means possible political scenarios that can be compared with the business as usual, where you would not do anything, just, everything would stay the same as today. And we have looked at a number of different scenarios, not just the Clinton scenario and the scenario back to 67, which is sometimes discussed, but also the Palestinian scenario. And it turns out all of those political scenarios that have been discussed in the recent past would produce an improvement in terms of a reduction of the level of violence. So we're getting into a situation where these models can help to inform decision makers about possible implications of what might happen if you do this or that. And for this, we need to have empirically grounded simulation models, for example, agent-based models. So we have seen noise matters in many respects. It can have positive and negative effects. Negative like triggering the breakdown of free traffic. Positive effects like the outbreak of cooperation. And now the question is, what can we learn from it for the future of society? And one approach is our society is a complex system, our economy as well. And some people say we need to control this complexity. We need to force it basically to behave in a certain favorable way. And this idea goes back to the Leviathan, even more actually. So Thomas Hobbes was basically saying without a strong state, people would behave like beasts, like wolves. And so we need to force them to behave in a proper way. And that's why we have tons of laws and regulations, and we have enforcement institutions. And it's working reasonably well, but it's terribly expensive. So most industrialized countries have debts of the order of 100% of GDP, some of them even 200% of GDP. And to be honest, let's face it, we don't have a clue how we should ever pay it back. Yeah? Never heard a politician say how it would work. And so we might get into a situation where we'll not be able to pay for this anymore. What would be the alternatives? Well, first of all, I'd like to also point out that these attempts to control complex systems are often very ineffective. First of all, because complex systems can often not be well predicted, maybe on a short time scale with a certain probability, as in our weather forecast, but there are principal limits of predictability. In this case, it's the phenomenon of turbulence. So it's not that we wouldn't have the equations to describe it, but those equations themselves imply that after some time we cannot predict anymore what will happen. And a similar thing, of course, is known for social systems. The other problem is complex systems are so difficult to control because they're dominated by internal interactions in the system. They're kind of stronger. And so if you are a politician or a manager want to change the system, you try to change a parameter, payment, whatever, and you find yourself often disappointed that it doesn't have the effect that you want to have. And you say, okay, we need to force it a little bit more, and then you get here, and then still you're disappointed about the outcome. And let's force it again a little bit more, and then you get to this tipping point, and suddenly your system switches to a completely different state, often very surprisingly, unexpectedly, and not exactly the outcome that you wanted to have. Here is another example. This is a predator-prey system where we assume that there is a hunter who's trying to get the system to this point over here, but instead the system is driven to a completely different point. So these are just some of the problems that you face in complex systems. So forcing the system is not a good idea. So can we just let it happen? as Adam Smith has basically proposed, he said the invisible hand will fix it. Bottom-up self-organization is how we would call it today, and it was kind of inspired by the observation that beehives were social communities that organized themselves very well. Well, we say there is a queen in the beehive, but it doesn't give any commands, actually. Same thing with ants or termites. All of those social structures, which are really very fascinating and quite complex, result just from very, very simple interactions. Of course, evolution had millions of years to get there. But the question is, why doesn't it work in our society? Or does it work? That's kind of the question that we should ask. Okay, here the invisible hand sometimes works. Like in the pedestrian flows you can see over here, there is lane formation, and those lanes basically avoid blockages in the flow if the density is not too high. People don't have to plan this. There is no law that enforces this. There is no traffic regulation enforcing it. People do that automatically, subconsciously. They're not even aware of this. So this is really an invisible hand kind of phenomenon, really fascinating. So couldn't this be the way our society and economy could work? Well, we can understand it, by the way, with mathematical models. There are many publications about it. But the problem is that the invisible hand fails when the desirable system state is unstable. In particular, if you push the system towards its limits, for example, when the interaction strength exceeds a certain critical threshold, and that often happens if, for example, the density is very high, such as here during the crowd disaster in Duisburg during the love rate. Nobody wanted to harm anybody or kill anybody here. That was, again, an undesired outcome of a systemic instability. We call this crowd turbulence, an undesired outcome as the traffic jam we've seen before. So the invisible hand doesn't always fix it. And that's actually why we have top-down regulation in our political system, basically to try to fix it. But neither Adam Smith's invisible hand nor the attempts to fix it top-down have actually avoided this environmental exploitation. You don't see it here with this bean very well, but here almost no trees anymore on one side of the boundary, border between Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And on the other side, there are a lot of trees still. And environmental pollution, overfishing, global warming, tax evasion, free riding, you name it, there's so many problems we haven't fixed over hundreds of years. Why? With all this technology and all the data that we have and the best science that we ever had, why are we not able to fix these problems? Or is there a solution finally? Albert Einstein said we cannot solve our problems within the same kind of thinking that created them. Maybe we just have to change our thinking and do it in a completely different way than we have approached it in the past. So we have tried this central planner in the economy, where the organization of our economy is top-down, the regulation is top-down. In most countries, it didn't work very well. We're trying this where we have a bottom-up organization and, however, a top-down regulation where the Homoeconomicus and the invisible hands don't manage to fix problems like tragedies of the commons, market failures, and so on. But we are also seeing we are struggling actually to cope with certain problems like the financial crisis. Yeah? And for a long time, I also believed this public credo, there is nothing better than what we have today. It might not be perfect, but there's no alternative. That's what I've heard 1,000 times. But then, eventually, after many years of thinking, I came to the conclusion that we could have a system where we have a bottom-up organization and self-organization, but also a bottom-up regulation. And I call the system a participatory market society. It requires, however, another regarding behavior, and I call this kind of behavior that a Homo socialis would show. So this is basically now bridging between the paradigms of economics and the paradigms of the social science, the other social sciences, I should say. And we have done a computer simulation of merciless forces of evolution that are expected to produce a Homo economicus. In fact, for most parameter combinations, they also did. But we found that under certain conditions, surprisingly, a Homo socialis with other regarding preferences comes out. And that other regarding Homo socialis is actually doing better, getting a higher payoff because the Homo socialis is able to overcome the tragedy of the commons, while the Homo economicus is running into the tragedy of the commons. So what is the Homo socialis? It turns out to be a conditionally cooperative kind of human, takes self-determined, but other regarding decisions. It means it considers the impact on others. You know, we have the ability of empathy, we have this ability of putting ourselves into the shoes of others, and that must have a reason. It enables us to be social, to be a Homo socialis. And it basically also implies interdependent decisions, networked minds in some sense. And I often argue that now social media are connecting those minds and are supporting the social behavior of people, potentially, at least. And of course, there can be this collective intelligence effect by putting many minds together. Now here's a computer simulation where we start with 100% of unfriendly Homo economici, and as time goes on, over a number of generations, we find that friendliness emerges in our evolutionary computer simulation, which has just assumptions of evolution, like mutation in selection, and otherwise assumes utility maximization according to a best response rule. That means economic assumptions. No imitation. That would make it very simple to create cooperation. A really best response which would usually eliminate cooperation. But the combination of these rules, surprisingly again, leads to an outcome that one wouldn't expect. And that is actually very well consistent with experimental or empirical results about how real people behave. There is this Homo economicus. It does exist. Some people are like that, but the majority of people are actually different, and that is actually well reproduced by our computer simulation. Of course, we know the work of Ernst Fehr about fairness. We know the work on the ultimatum game. All of this has puzzled economists and has questioned the Homo economicus concept, but so far we didn't have a theory to understand how these fairness preferences would emerge. Now we do have an evolutionary theory, a mathematical approach that allows us to understand this. And by the way, even Adam Smith was aware of this. He said, however selfish man may be supposed, there are evidently some principles in his nature which interest him in the fortune of others and render the happiness necessary to him, though he derives nothing from it. Why didn't this really establish the basis of our economic thinking? Why do we still have the Homo economicus in our books? Because as I will argue later, if you have the wrong institutions, the Homo socialis would behave like a Homo economicus. I'd like now to underline that the Homo socialis is outperforming other forms of organizations of our economy or society. And I'm illustrating this with an example from traffic simulation, which of course is not exactly a social model, but it has quite some similarities in the sense that traffic is a system with a scarcity of resources, like space and time, space in particular, and service capacity, where we cannot satisfy everybody's demand at the same time. There's a conflict of interest, and that's why you have to prioritize people through traffic lights and so on. And this is our classical control approach, top-down with a central traffic authority. And let's compare that with two other approaches. One would be based on the concept of the Homoeconomicus, where each intersection separately would strictly minimize the waiting times of the cars approaching that intersection. And another approach that's inspired by the Homo socialis, where the intersection would also try to minimize waiting times, but there are other regarding in the sense that they're communicating with their neighboring intersections and trying to coordinate with them. In particular, if a traffic jam grows large, to avoid spillover effects that this intersection would not really have to care about, but to be friendly to this intersection, to avoid spillover effects, it would prioritize this queue to make sure it will be reduced and spillover effects would be avoided. And let's see how those three different organizations perform. This is the queue length shown over the capacity utilization of the intersection. And you see this top-down regulation is doing reasonably well, but the Homo economicus approach with the selfish optimization of each intersection is doing much better, much shorter queue lengths. However, there's a certain capacity utilization where the invisible hand fails to do a good job. Suddenly, the queue lengths explode. And finally, we have this self-regulation approach based on the Homo socialis, the other regarding self-organization, which is performing as well as the Homo economicus at low capacity utilizations, but is performing better than any other strategy all the way to the highest capacity utilization. So it's, in fact, a superior way of organization, in particular in a system that cannot be well planned in advance because the variability is large. In this case, the variability of the traffic flows. That makes it very difficult to predict, and that's why flexible response is superior to top-down planning. So decentralization allows one to manage and harness the increasing level of complexity and diversity of global systems. This is kind of a generalization of this idea, but anyway, we have this decentralized traffic light control here and produces wonderful green waves by self-organization. It's not enforced on the system. It's inspired by this observation that we made in pedestrian flows that at a bottleneck there would be oscillatory flows. And so we have transferred the self-organization principle from bottlenecks to intersections, and it has worked beautifully. The problem is that the wrong institutional settings, such as anonymous homogeneous markets and others, actually don't allow the Homo socialis to thrive. Actually, they turn them into a Homo economicus, and that's why we often find a Homo economicus. We see that over here in this phase diagram. It requires certain kinds of conditions for the Homo socialis to thrive. In this case, the conditions in our simulations are that local reproduction, where offspring stay close to their parents, is largely promoting other regarding preferences. Now the question is, can we find a way of organization of our social and economic systems that are capable of overcoming the destabilization of our global system with this increasing networking. I've shown you this before. And I think, so again, we're networking our world more and more. That has the implication that certain systems will more and more destabilize. And I think governments all over the world are recognizing this. The financial crisis is just one example, but we see social unrest in many areas of the world. So governments are recognizing this, and that's why we have so many surveillance attempts all over the world. The question is there an alternative? A mechanism that would stabilize a social and economic order in a globalized world? And I believe, yes, reputation systems can fix it. They can basically introduce a feedback loop that is stabilizing the system, that is promoting responsible behavior, that is supporting high-quality products, and so on. It will support the Homo socialis. It's basically transferring the principle of social communities, success principles, to the global village. And in fact, we see a quick spreading of reputation systems all over the internet. And people have said, okay, we're now the like us generation, so people are liking things or disliking things, and that's creating reputation systems. We have this also at eBay and many other platforms. And scientists have studied this, and it turns out that reputation systems are good both for sellers and buyers. Sellers can sell the products at a higher price if they have a good reputation, while buyers get a better service and feel more comfortable about the service. So reputation systems can be good for everybody, and I think it can be basically the starting point of a new way of organizing our social and economic world that's potentially capable of overcoming a number of very old problems like the tragedy of the commons. And as I've also tried to indicate, I believe that now eventually theories of economic and social behavior are growing together. We can have a unified theoretical approach, but we need to have a new perspective on our economy, and as social media are flourishing and reputation mechanisms are flourishing, it's going to change the dynamics of our economy. And I do believe that on the long run, I cannot say what will happen on the short run, interestingly. But on the long run, I think you will get towards a more participatory society, because as the complexity of the system grows, we need a more decentralized, a more bottom-up approach. That means more participation, and that's what people all over the world are asking for. And we can do it. Thank you.